During the most recent episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, Maher was able to extract two major public concessions from two major conservatives. One, Dr. Phil, an enthusiastic Trump supporter who admitted that Trump's efforts to redistrict Texas is a pure power grab, and another being George Will, a legendary conservative who admitted that the Republican Party that he used to call home is totally complicit in Trump's authoritarianism and corruption. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a couple of clips to play here. We haven't talked about Bill Maher in a minute. It was largely right-wing guess. He had George Will, he had Dr. Phil, and he had Stephen A. Smith. And I know people say, oh, Stephen A. Smith is a liberal. Stephen A. Smith, as far as I'm concerned, is like kind of a right-leaning centrist. I mean, that guy spends more time bitching about the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, more time bitching about Democrats than Trump, trying to flex his centrist bona fides with the right. So for all intents and purposes, he's a functional conservative as far as I'm concerned. So this was a pretty skewed right episode of Bill Maher. And yet Maher was able to forcefully make the case for Trump's Trump's corruption and authoritarianism. And he even extracted a pretty reluctant concession, but public concession, from a visibly uncomfortable Dr. Phil.
Now, here's my question, Dr. Phil. You're from Texas. This is some bullshit, isn't it?
Was there a question in there?
That was it. This is some bullshit, isn't it?
Well, it depends. They're not the only ones that have done this. Democrats do it as well. They've done it in Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania.
After the sentence.
So a couple of things. Florida and Ohio have been gerrymandered by Republicans, not Democrats. And of course, this is in reference to Texas's mid-decade redistricting plan to steal 5 congressional seats for the Democratic Party. For the Republican Party, for Trump.
Oh, no. It's not always done after the census. It's done between as well. And clearly, it's done for reasons to change the distribution.
Even Stephen A. Smith is like, dude, I grade Trump on a curve, but bro, come on. Like even Stephen A. Smith is unamused and unimpressed by Dr. Phil tying himself in knots so as to avoid criticizing Trump.
Texas is doing it because they say because they've got more Republican voters now, they should have more representation. Is that bullshit? Yeah, sort of.
Yes. Okay. So there was an answer. Now.
So Stephen A. Smith said yes, and Dr. Phil's like, sheepishly, I guess it's some bullshit. It is some bullshit. So a couple of things. Let's just fact check here. Do both parties gerrymander? Yes. Do both parties redistrict? Yes. Are they both equally bad, equally egregious, and equally frequent in this respect? No, no, and no. And this is the problem. There's so many centrists like Dr. Phil, who again is a Trump supporter. He spoke at the RNC. He's appeared by Trump, I think, during when Trump showed up for this like FEMA submergency panel when Texas had those tragic floods in South Texas, and Dr. Phil is a Texas resident. Dr. Phil, who has no expertise, he's just a celebrity who happens to be from Texas, right? He has no expertise in this specific area. Was a guest for Trump because, of course, Trump only cares about star power, and he just spent the entire time just slobbering all over Trump and kissing his ass, saying patently ridiculous things in order to inflate his ego. So the thing is, Dr. Phil wants you to believe, and he went right to it. He felt like if I'm going to criticize Trump, I've got to do it softly and I've got to pad it. I've got to say, well, both sides do it. It's like I've used this metaphor before. It's like saying that a shoplifter and a murderer are both criminals, and that's the end of the analysis. Wow, this murderer is really bad. Well, I mean, shoplifter and murderer, I mean, they're both criminals, right? I mean, like both sides, both people do it, right? But it misses the point, which is that in both frequency and egregiousness, I mean, this has been forensically examined multiple times by multiple different sources. The Republican Party they're much more likely to ruthlessly and frequently trying to gerrymander the hell out of their states. And not just their states, not just red states, but also swing states. I live in a swing state, North Carolina. Republicans have gerrymandered the hell out of it. Wisconsin, a swing state, Republicans have tried to gerrymander the hell out of it. Now, the liberal Wisconsin Supreme Court has walked some of that damage back. We just have nothing comparable in the Democratic Party. And I suspect Dr. Phil knows this, that if we actually like break down the merits, okay, who gerrymanders more, who gerrymanders more egregiously, and who's more likely to do it in flip states, like swing states, right? Because it's bad enough when blue and red states try to maximize their advantage, but at the very least you can say, okay, well, at least they were going to skew blue anyway. They were going to skew red anyway. This is New York. It's a blue bastion. This is Mississippi. It's a red bastion. But when you try to do it in competitive states, when you briefly have power and then you work to institutionalize it, I would argue that that's worse. And Republicans are much more likely to do that. And mid-decade redistricting, as far as I'm aware, Democrats have never mid-decade redistricted. Texas did it back in 2003 under Republicans. They're doing it now at Trump's explicit behest. Again, I have no analog to this. And I'll also point out that to the extent that independent redistricting committees exist, where it takes it out of the hands of partisan politicians so as to avoid partisan gerrymandering, those are blue states that do it. New York, California, for example. Republicans don't forfeit their gerrymandering power. They want to cling to it desperately. They want to rig the system against Democrats. And it's only ever been Democrats to push for a federal gerrymandering ban. Democrats were the ones under Biden, actually under Trump first in the Democratic-led House in 2019, said, let's pass a law that bans federal gerrymandering in blue and red states and swing states. We all put our knives down, metaphorically speaking. And Republicans said no under Trump and again under President Biden. So again, either Dr. Phil is really stupid or he's being really dishonest, but to pretend to even imply that the two sides are equally bad on this is just bullshit. The Republicans are objectively worse. And so even Dr. Phil was forced to reluctantly concede, I guess this is kind of some bullshit. Now, the other conservative in this episode, other than, again, I would argue Stephen A. Smith, he's the most liberal of the three conservatives, is a guy named George Will. Now, George Will is a legendary conservative, libertarian bent reporter. I think he worked for the Wall Street Journal. He currently writes, I know, for the Washington Post. He's a lifelong conservative. He's also a contributor to News Nation, which is that network that Chris Cuomo appears in. He's a guest on Leland Vittert's show. This is what he had to say about the party that he used to call home. That was his political home, about their complicity in Trump's moral, spiritual, and political crimes.
How responsible do you think Republicans over the decades leading up to Trump are responsible for him? Because nothing happens in a vacuum.
You know, the complicated process brought him to power. Once he got to power, the Republicans decided that they were no longer an independent branch of government. They no longer had rivalrous jealousy on behalf of their institutions, which Madison presupposed as making the separation of powers work. They decided they were the blocking and tackling for the quarterback named Trump. They are completely complicit in this and completely disgraced.
And because you are nothing if not a man of principles, I mean, you left the Republican Party when he ran for the first time. Do they try to get you back?
I don't think they miss me, frankly.
And listen, again, I disagree with George Will on policy, but I do agree that he is a relatively principled conservative, and he's 84 years old. He's got a very dry sense of humor. He makes the audience laugh multiple times in that episode of Real Time with Bill Maher. He's got a very dry sense of humor. He's a conservative historian as well, and he talks about Madisonian principles. And, you know, again, my favorite, as you all know, if you frequent this channel, my three favorite presidents, George Washington is number one, then Abraham Lincoln, then FDR. And I know for a lot, those are usually the big three, and no matter who is polled, right? Usually, more often than not, President Lincoln is listed as first, and then Washington is second or third, usually second. But anyway, the point is, one of the reasons that I politically revere President Washington is his relationship with power. I think he had a more principled and aspirational relationship with power than any U.S. president ever afterwards. Even President Lincoln, again, easily you could make the case that Lincoln was not just the second greatest president, but the greatest president. But even Lincoln had to hoard executive power in order to successfully prosecute the case against the Confederacy and wage the Civil War. I mean, you could easily make the case that the imperial presidency as we know it today began with Lincoln, at least in a prototypical form. Washington eschewed power. And George Will makes the case later on in that episode of Real Time with Bill Maher that was one of the reasons why the founding fathers, as they were designing the presidency, left so much up to Washington, because they knew that George Washington would be the first president, and they trusted Washington, who did not want power in the first place as the general of the Continental Army. When he was effectively drafted into service and made the general of the Continental Army after he emerged victorious over the British, rather than seize power, which is what some of his officers wanted and what was expected at the time, that's what people did, Napoleon and others as well, he walked into the Continental Congress, and even though they were totally at his mercy, he could have snapped his fingers and replaced George III, the British king, and became George I, the new American king. He renounced his commission, and he turned power back over to the Congress. Then he had to be dragged kicking and screaming to lead to preside over the Constitutional Convention, right? So he had enormous influence if he wanted to shape the Constitution in a way which would have benefited him. He didn't. He merely presided and established order as the debates occurred. Then he was effectively drafted kicking and screaming to become the first president. He did not want it. He didn't want to run for a second term. They begged him. They said, "Listen, you're midwifing the country. We need you to stay on for a second term." And so he did, reluctantly. And then finally, he drew his foot in his line in the sand after a second term. I'm not running for a third term, come hell or high water, period. And there was no 22nd Amendment at the time, which prevented a third term. Washington could have been president for life. Could have been king. He could have been a conquering general, and he chose not to be those things. And so they make a good case that they envision statesmen like Washington as occupying the presidency, or President Lincoln, and obviously that wasn't the case forever. Trump is a demagogue and an authoritarian, the likes of which we've never seen, and we've had some pretty shitty presidents, but Trump is a breed apart. So I definitely encourage you to watch the whole thing. I want to bring this up too about how George Will left the Republican Party. This is from 2016. This is a quote from him, and this is during an interview on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace at the time. He says, George, I want to talk to you. You announced this week you've left the Republican Party. Why? He says, you know what? I wonder if I can play this clip.
Will and USA Today columnist Kirsten Powers. Well, before we get to Britain leaving the EU, George, I want to talk about you. You announced this week that you have left the Republican Party. Why?
I left it for the same reason I joined it in 1964 when I voted for Barry Goldwater. I joined it because I was a conservative. I leave for the same reason that I'm a conservative. Give you a timeline. Shortly after Trump became the presumptive nominee, he had a summit meeting with Paul Ryan where they stressed their common principles and their vast shared ground, which is much more important than their differences. I thought that was puzzling, doubly so because Paul Ryan still didn't endorse him. After Trump went after the Mexican judge from northern Indiana, then Paul Ryan endorsed him. And I decided that, in fact, this is not my party anymore. I changed my registration to unaffiliated 23 days ago. I hardly made an announcement. I just mentioned this in a meeting with the Federalist Society. So the long and the short of it is, as Ronald Reagan said when he changed his registration, I did not leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
Now, not surprisingly, Donald Trump.
There you have it. The reason George Will left the Republican Party is because, for all his faults, and again, I don't agree with conservative principle, I prefer liberal or progressive policy, is that George Will is a consistent conservative. He's a principled conservative, and Donald Trump isn't. He's a demagogue. He's a populist, and he just recognized that the Republican Party is much more ripe for the taking and reforging into an authoritarian cult of personality. And so that's why he jumped what he did. I would definitely encourage you guys to go back and watch this episode of Real Time with Bill Maher. Again, when you think of Dr. Phil and Stephen A. Smith, you're talking about two profoundly frustrating people. So I get your instinct to probably walk away from it. But there were times Stephen A. Smith pushed back on Dr. Phil, which was good. Bill Maher pushed back on Trump a lot. The conversation with George Will and Bill Maher is definitely worth it. And I will say, as somebody who, again, gets really frustrated with Bill Maher, particularly his culture war takes, certainly some of his foreign policy takes, one thing that I do appreciate about him is he recognizes that the Republican Party on its best day is still worse than the Democratic Party on its worst day. And even after meeting with Trump, he is very vocal about how Trump is a corrupt authoritarian. And that's really inspiring because we need as many people, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, to maintain that as their northern star. If you're a conservative like George Will, so be it. But just recognize, as George Will does recognize in this dialogue, that Trump is the most corrupt and authoritarian president we've ever seen. So we need to have some sort of commonality in that respect. Definitely check it out. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.